Bruno was one of the great architects behind the legal and regulatory framework that allowed Brazil to become one of the main markets for fintechs globally.
Execution is everything. Great idea, great, but if the person doesn't have execution, it doesn't work. Money was available for these companies, which then started to grow very, very fast without necessarily seeking profit. Why don't we create a new set of rules to incentivize players to come in first in the payment sector? If you go to the street here, you see a beggar, someone begging money. Instead of asking cash, they give the PIX number. Tokenization is allowing transformation of money on something that was illiquid because of the lack of technology. Brazil is not for beginners because it's a complex market, very sophisticated, and you need to be very fast in decision making.
Hola a todos, bienvenidos a un nuevo capítulo del podcast de Keyfan. Este capítulo ha sido posible gracias al apoyo de Google. Además de ser partner de Keyfan, Google colabora activamente con muchas de nuestras participadas, impulsando la innovación a través de la inteligencia artificial. Google Cloud está ayudando a desarrollar productos y aplicaciones de inteligencia artificial de vanguardia como Gemini, Notebook LM y muchos de sus otros servicios. Además, Google pone a disposición de las startups su programa de créditos, que en el caso de las empresas que estén desarrollando proyectos de inteligencia artificial pueden alcanzar los 350.000 euros. Y ahora os dejo con el último capítulo del podcast de Keyfan.
Good morning, everyone. I'm here with Gustavo. How are you, Gustavo?
Doing great. Good morning.
Who's our guest today?
Our guest today is Bruno Balduccini. Bruno Balduccini is a partner at Pinheiro Neto. But even more than that, Bruno was one of the great architects behind the legal and regulatory framework that allowed Brazil to become one of the main markets for fintechs globally. This movement allowed virtually the entire Brazilian population to be included in the financial system, and the cost of maintaining a bank account dropped to practically zero. So basically revolutionary in the country. In addition to that, there was the introduction of PIX, which of course we're going to talk about and we participated, which quickly became the most widely adopted payment method in the country and became a global reference. Bruno, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here with you guys.
Thank you. Bruno, I think a good way to start is to tell us a bit about your background in terms of where does your family come from? How did your parents end up in Brazil of all places?
Sure. So I am a first generation Brazilian, but if I say that to my mother, she gets upset and you will understand why in a minute. So my parents are both Italian. They came to Brazil for their honeymoon in the 1960s. And my father was an engineer, an architect. My mother was studying law school, and then they were on their honeymoon. They wanted to go to Rio. But at the time, 1960, right, there were only very few flights, and only, I think, Alitalia used to fly. Alitalia doesn't exist anymore, right? But used to fly to São Paulo, so they would get then a bus to go to Rio at the time. And so they went there, their honeymoon, spent, I think, a week or something. And then on the way back, they had to stop in São Paulo to get the next flight available. And they went to a little bar in the city close to Avenida Paulista, which was a very small city in the 60s. And they met this French guy who was an engineer. And this French guy started to chat with my parents. And then he learned that my father was an engineer and say, what are you doing? So I'm going back to Italy. I'm starting to work now in this very small engineer company in Rome. He said, no, you're crazy. Stay here. You know, this is the city of the future. This is the country of the future. Why don't you stay? And he said, okay. And so they went back to Italy. They grabbed their stuff, literally one suitcase, went back to Sao Paulo, rented a house where today only buildings exist, and started to work as an engineer. And then he started to move, and he ended up staying. And so I was born, I have an older sister, and I was born here in Sao Paulo. So when I say, well, you Brazilian? I say yes. And my mother interrupts angry, in an angry voice, and says, no, you are Italian. Doesn't matter where the blood that counts. Doesn't matter where you're born. So that's her statement of purpose every time I mention that. So I am a Brazilian, Italian parents, was raised in Brazil, studied in Brazilian law schools, Brazilian schools, then went to law school here in Brazil. And here in Brazil, while you're studying law, which is a 5-year program, you end up start working early as well. So you work and study at the same time. So on the 3rd year of law school, I actually entered this law firm today called Pinheiro Neto, and I started as a trainee. And basically what you do, you learn very basic stuff during the law school years, and then if you survive, you continue the career, and then you stay on as junior lawyer, mid lawyer, senior lawyer. So I did the whole career. The firm finances masters. So I ended up, when I was a senior lawyer, full to senior lawyer, went to the United States, and I did my master's at Boston University on banking law studies. And then the second year, we usually send our lawyers to work in law firms in US, because obviously or Europe, right? But mainly US. And so I worked in a law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell, which is a very traditional American law firm. And then I ended up staying a year and a bit, and then in the States, and then I went back and continued here until I was made partner basically 11 years ago, 20 years ago, sorry. And so I've been working in the banking sector in this area. I had a fantastic boss, and then I decided to try to grow the banking sector of the firm. And then this coincided with a very good regulator, which is the central bank, which expanded the banking sector into payments, crypto. And so I've been doing this for now 33 years in the firm.
Amazing. I want to go back to the regulator later, but would you just give a little glimpse of what Pinheiro Neto is? I mean, for Brazilians, it's a household name, but not exactly for Europeans.
Yeah, sure. So it is a 82, 83-year-old law firm. It is, although the name is Pinheiro Neto, which is the founder, there is nobody in the family anymore. So it's a fully democratized law firm, pure partnership. It is very, very traditional. It has 700 lawyers, about 1,000 employees total. We have offices in São Paulo, Rio, and Brasilia. And we have a couple of rep offices outside, one in the US and one in Japan. And basically, we do corporate law in all aspects. So we do corporate, we do litigation, we do tax, we do labor, always representing the employer. And we have a huge network of other law firms in Europe and in the States and other countries where we refer each other and stuff like that. So it's a very, very traditional law firm.
And is there a way or a data you can mention us to show the size of the law firm, which is immense? I mean, in Brazil is really immense.
Yeah, you see, for European standards, it is quite big because it's not that common to find. Obviously, we have very large Spanish law firms that are our friends as well. We would classify ourselves as obviously the top 3 or 4 in size. However, you find mass litigation law firms with 3,000 lawyers in Brazil. And so our goal is not to be the largest in number of law firms, but we prefer to be the most profitable one, which is the best option to consider a law firm. So we are on the top 3 or 4 in size, but obviously our focus is really corporations and complex transactions, banking, and tax.
Amazing. And the U.S. office is in the Bay Area, right?
Right. We have an office in the Bay Area. The reason being, we have obviously the big techs as our clients. And so we felt the need to have a small office there. So when we travel in the Bay Area, we ended up, using that as home base, but it's more an office. We don't have a full-fledged law firm there. And we always focus on Brazilian law only. We don't do U.S. law or any other law.
Right. Well, going deeper now into the subject of this conversation, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, Brazil in the second half of the 20th century, in the financial sector, there were a lot of banking busts, so banks going underwater, and the Brazilian Central Bank, the regulator, and the government as a whole championed the concentration movement within the bank. So in the end of the 20th century, we ended up with a very, very concentrated or oligopolized financial market and incredibly profitable. So most likely one of the most profitables in the world, if not the one. And that's where we are in 2000, early 2000s. How did that turn out to make Brazil become the Latin American leader, or maybe the global leader in the fintech segment? What were the reasons and scenarios for that to happen?
Sure. Well, I think I can answer, Gustavo, that is a direct correlation with economy. So Brazil, we faced back then hyperinflation, economic plans, change of currency. So it was very unstable, high inflationary market. And because of that, the banks that were existed at the time obviously lived and managed to live based on the inflation. So if you leave the money of your client at your bank, because of inflation, the power of purchase of this money goes away. However, if the bank invests this money, you get a huge amount of float. And because the inflation was very high, the base interest rates, in order to try to control the inflation, was extremely high. So banks at the time made a lot of money, much less on banking transactions and lending, much more on float and any hedging structures. What happened is that when they decided to create the Plano Real, which is the first long-term plan to end inflation, change the currency here, what happened is that it was very successful. And so inflation dropped to 3,000% a year to 20% and then 12% and then went back to one-digit inflation in a very short period of time. And what happened is that several of these banks that were living on inflationary profits basically started to have their mechanism and their modus of operandi challenged. And some banks became not viable. And so what happened is that because in Brazil you have unlimited liability of the controlling shareholders of banks, in other words, a controlling shareholder of a bank, if the bank fails, his own assets are used to pay for all the debts, irrespective of guilt or fault, which is a very Brazilian, very typical Brazilian, which is quite unique. And the officers of the bank as well, there was a lot of ideas that the central bank would see a bank not viable, would go to the larger banks and say, hey, why don't you buy this bank? We avoid, problems with the previous controlling shareholders, because if they don't have money, the central bank and the government will have the cost. So why don't you guys buy this bank? So the central bank basically influenced and pushed banks, larger banks, to purchase smaller banks in difficulty. And this happened also with foreign banks. So you could see BBVA at the time, they were invited to buy JP Morgan. They all were invited to buy Bank of America as well. And obviously Bradesco, Itaú, and traditional ones, and Santander were all invited to buy banks here as a way to grow and to solve the problem of the market. So this explains why there was the natural concentration. Also, because of this economic plans, inflation, the central bank tend to be during, and still is today, a more conservative regulator when compared to other regulators. So, for example, we adopted a stricter Basel rule before other countries. We adopted stricter provisioning requirements because of instability of the market, the economic plans. So because of that, obviously, larger banks survive well in this whereby smaller banks will have more difficult with stricter rules. So this also contributed for this consolidation. But obviously, time has passed, technology started to appear, and the population started to question, saying, well, we don't have more inflation. We have a stable currency. Why interest rates are so high? And in fact, why, if you have smaller banks, and honestly, if I was owner of a bank, I would do exactly the same. If you have a small number of banks and you can charge Bruno, which is a good credit risk, 12% per month in interest in the credit card, and the competitor is charging the same thing, there is no need to put the prices down. So basically, the lack of competition and the high profits, as you mentioned, Gustavo, cause the banks to basically be in a very comfortable zone and charge high interest rates. But interestingly, the banks would not give loans to high risk credit. They would focus the loans on classes A and B of the population, so higher end, with a better chance of repaying, and would not give credit to the lower end of the population because that's a higher risk, difficulty of recovering the money. So this was how the market was. So if you look at the macroeconomic at the time, which is end of inflation, stability of the currency, people and push from Congress questioning why interest rates, and new technologies that would allow, for example, you to offer a loan in your cell phone and not in a branch, caused the central bank to question the model and say, okay, we need to create some kind of competition. But the point is that Brazil was very open to foreign investors. We never had restrictions for foreign banks to come in, right? You see, look at the Spanish banks, look at the American banks, the Italian banks, they all came into Brazil, but they ended up, the majority leaving because macroeconomic solutions or, competing in the market. So the problem was not offering or incentivizing foreign banks to come in. They had to find another way to attract competition. So one way that the central bank realized, and again, you have to look at the technology appearing at the time, was why don't we create a new set of rules to incentivize players to come in first in the payment sector? So why don't we go to Congress, because the central bank could only regulate banks, they could not regulate fintechs or payment institutions, went to Congress, and Congress respects the central bank a lot, issued a new set of laws that allow the central bank to regulate what we call the payment institutions, which are issuers of credit card, issuers of e-money and e-wallets, and acquiring business. So they came up with these rules. But the central bank was super aggressive in that aspect because they would allow payment institutions to start operating without central bank license. And only if you hit specific volume thresholds, you would continue to operate and you would then apply for a license. So that's one thing. So you could offer Bruno wallets to you, Gustavo, and I'm not regulated. I would take your money, and the central bank would allow this until a specific volume was achieved. So it was pretty aggressive. The second thing they did is they went to the credit card companies, the networks, and they said, okay, we need to regulate the rules that you allow for issuing and acquiring. The rules that you have currently at the time were rules that would be very subjective. So you would, American Express, Visa, Mastercard would only allow a large bank, but a small company that wanted to become an issuer or an acquirer would never be approved because there was no need. I can concentrate on the larger companies and banks, which are much better risk. So the central bank changed based on these rules and obliged the networks to allow issuers and acquirers to be accepted without discrimination, and oblige these companies to change their rules to adopt only objective criteria for approval. So if a small issuer, which did not have central bank approval at the time, met the objective criteria, the network had to accept. And that explains why you see names like PagSeguro, Nubank, Stone, right, of this that today are very famous, because the central bank changed these two things. First, cost of entry is zero. You can start operating without a license. And two, if you want to join the networks cannot discriminate. They have to have the same standard for approval. And so that explains a lot the first important change in the market. So then you start coming this massive amount of these new companies, but this coincides with a lot of liquidity in the VC world, obviously, otherwise it would not be possible. So a lot of money was available for these companies, which then started to grow very, very fast without necessarily seeking profit. They wanted to get the market. So when you get this conjunction of things at the same time, this created what we call the perfect storm, because these guys came in, they would offer accounts, the e-wallets, they would offer cards to classes C and D because classes A and B were already with the big banks. So they attacked, let's say, a totally green, blue sky market, right? They didn't have any problem there. But because of technology, they were much better. And so parts of the population A and B and said, oh, my bank is such a pain. I need to send copy of my documents to open an account, whereby I go to Neon, I go to Nubank, and I can open an account by the app. I don't need to go to the branch anymore. I can make payments through the app. You know what? I'm going to start using these guys. And so this also pushed the traditional banks to say, oh my God, we're losing clients. We need to bring new technologies. We need to be paperless. We need to be less bureaucratic. And so that was the initial of the change that today is a very different market.
That's super interesting. Sorry, Gus. I was gonna mention that it's interesting how sometimes the dots end up connecting themselves and how timing plays a role. Because I was thinking about the example in Spain. So the fintech sector here started to grow I would say right after the financial crisis of 2008, 2012. And in Spain, not the main banks, but there were smaller banks that were pretty much governed by local governments and by the states. They did things that they should not have done and had to ended up being bailed out by the government and by the taxpayer. So that meant that the central bank got probably overprotection and overregulated, and the whole fintech sector, which was starting to boom, suffered. And I remember at the time talking to, KFund was not even born back then, obviously, but I remember having friends in the fintech sector trying to create the next, similar to Square or Stone in Spain, but it was pretty much impossible because of licenses and stuff like that. And it would take a long time and there was not money available. And so it's interesting how sometimes like timing is super relevant for things to start to blossom, and how overregulation sometimes can kill certain initiatives, which is actually like a topic right now in Europe as well with the overregulation of AI.
Right. Yeah. But then you need to add something else as well, which is very Brazilian. Brazilians are very pro-tech. And Brazilians, due to, for example, violence, right? You're going to be robbed, prefer to use everything digital. So that also, right? That it's a lot of. Do you guys hear me? I can see it trying to reconnect. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, because I was on.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
So the population also plays an important role, because the demand of the population, whereby you compare, for example, to the US, right? In the US, people they still want to pay by check. They don't want to use digital payments, right? Whereby in Brazil, it's quite the opposite. I want to use digital payment. I don't want to go to the branch. I want to use more technology. So a lot has to do with how the population reacts to technology.
Yeah, I mean, you were mentioning this big regulatory melting pot that was going on in the beginning of the 2000s in Brazil, and looking backwards, it always seems easier than it actually was. But so all these things were happening, but it was not exactly easy to set up this company. So I mean, you actively participated in the creation of three of the most probably of the poster childs of this movement, which are Nubank, Stone, and PagSeguro, and there is a famous meeting of Cristina and of David and David Vélez and Cristina Junqueira, two of the Nubank co-founders, and with you that they ended up redesigning the bank or something like that. Could you go over, I mean, how challenging it was at the time, and how did you have to go around things or start a bank in this big regulatory changing environment?
Sure. So when Chris and Davi came here, obviously they came. I remember it's a funny story. It was a Friday, end of the day, and they came here to say we want to launch this credit card company, and I was like, yeah, so another credit card company. I wasn't very impressed. And Chris Junqueira, who's very, very smart, right? And she studies a lot. She goes after a lot of information. So she came, and we were discussing, how the credit card would work. And in Brazil, credit cards is the new rule allowed you to issue a postpaid instrument, which is the credit card. Mastercard or Visa, if Nubank at the time was not even called Nubank, would follow the standards, it would be accepted. But one thing that payment institutions, which is what Nubank was and is at the time, right? They cannot do revolving. Revolving means if you don't pay the minimum of your card statement at the end of the month, you have to refinancing. So refinancing can only be done through financial institutions. Payment institutions cannot lend money because only financial institutions, mainly banks, can perform that. And so we started to enter into a discussion with Cris Junqueira about the model, because she understood, based on some precedents in courts, that Nubank could also finance or do the revolve. And so we started to have a fight, saying, no, you can't do it. And if you do it, probably I'll have to introduce you to my criminal lawyer, because performing a loan without being a bank is a crime. So it doesn't work. And she was really insisting. And so after 2 hours discussing, the conversation ended like me saying, look, Chris, I'm telling you that this doesn't work and is illegal. But if you feel comfortable and you're basing yourself on other lawyers, go ahead, because if I cannot convince you, there's nothing else I can do. And so Davi said, no. we're going to follow what you're saying. We're not going to try this, and we're going to move on. So the problem is now we need to find a bank that will, one, perform the loans. But the problem is these banks do not want to hold this asset because nobody knows Nubank. They're going to say, you don't know how to give credit. Only banks know how to give credit. So what do we do? So then we help them to find a bank, and we created a model whereby at the time of the revolving, the bank would give the loan, but immediately thereafter, this loan would be purchased by Nubank. In other words, it would take off the balance sheet of the bank the revolving transaction. So this was the original model that was created. And obviously, we showed to the central bank because it was quite new and it was aggressive. And so we wanted to discuss with the central bank. And the central bank, and here's the important point, being a regulator trying to understand, received Nubank immediately and try to understand the model and basically express their opinion, saying, okay, this model works, so you can go ahead. So it's not very common to see a regulator saying, yeah, go ahead. So that was quite interesting way how everything started at Nubank. And interestingly, at this time, Davi started to show how they would onboard clients. We don't need to get documents. If I use this technology, I can cross-reference information, and I don't need. So we need to see that we need to, you central bank agree that the way we onboard, although the regulation doesn't say that specifically, we don't want to get the documents, because if you get the documents from the client, then the user experience is going to be horrible. So it needs to be a fantastic user experience. And the central bank says, yeah, I believe you can do it. And because they were drafting the regulations of institutions, they created the first set of rules already allowing digital onboarding, no documents, and cross-reference information. They were inspired on the technology they saw that Nubank was using.
And how was this received by the competitors? Because I mean, we're talking about some of the most powerful companies in the country, with a lot of political influence and trying to secure their oligopoly.
Yep. So obviously, in the beginning, nobody really believed in Nubank, right, or Neon, or any of these guys, because they're saying, another credit card company, you don't know how to give credit, you don't know how to grow, so forget it. So they didn't really pay attention. But the problem is, due to technology, their growth, and plus VC money, this has to be said, their growth was exponential. It was so fast that I believe the incumbent banks didn't see it coming, to be very honest. And when they realized, one of the first complaints was there is a disequilibrium between the set of rules. A payment institution, which is much lighter regulations, much lighter capital requirements, and they can do digital onboarding, whereby banks have all this bureaucracy, copy of documents, keeping documents for 10 years. And so the central bank says, okay, and they change the rules for the banks to allow digital onboarding, cross-reference information. So they basically change the rules the same level of the payment institutions. Now, although we would say, okay, now we can compete, is not true, because systems of banks, you cannot change them very quickly, right? These guys are core systems that existed over 10, 15, 20 years, and changing a system like that takes another couple of years. And so although they change the regulations, the adoption of faster, better technologies took several years because the incumbent banks couldn't really do it. So the banks complained, the central bank reacted, but they didn't deliver. That's the truth.
And that was also happening in card acquirers, and so as to enable Stone and PagSeguro to grow as fast as they did?
The same thing. They were using different technologies, and they were using better rates. Remember, the market was very, very concentrated, and at the time these guys came in, you had basically two acquirers, CL and Hede. And the prices they would charge was, a duopoly price. So there was a lot of room for the entrants to go for lower fees. And so that's how they manage. And plus, better technology, how to receive the merchant, how to reply questions of the merchant. And so that's why they immediately started to dominate or take a big portion of the market share.
And was this happening only in Brazil? I mean, in such a powerful movement, or not?
I would say at the time, in the beginning, we were talking about 2013, 2018, okay? At that time, yes. But around 2018, you start seeing other jurisdictions like Colombia, Peru, Mexico as well, looking in the cases of success. and started to say, we could adopt that. So it's kind of a started here, but inspired other models as well.
So some countries are famously catching up to innovation using the Brazilian central bank model or Brazilian central bank as a technology provider, right? Was this what enabled this movement?
So I think two things enabled this movement. One is that, and a little bit of a story here, right? So 2013, 2017, you're talking about the payment institutions, the Neons, the PagSeguros, the Nubank, right? Around 2015, 16, we start seeing credit model. Remember the example I mentioned whereby these financial institutions would lend money to the clients of Nubank, and then Nubank would purchase. So we start to see technology on granting credits using the cell phone. And so we start to see American companies coming in, copying the American models, try to lend money this way. But again, you cannot lend if you're not a bank. And interestingly, we created a model, legally speaking, whereby, similar to the Nubank model, a bank using an app would allow someone to take a loan, but immediately thereafter, the credit risk would be transferred to the fintech that was providing the platform offering the loan. And so we created this. We, legally speaking, we thought it was solid, and we took it to the central bank as well. And I remember was a meeting with some of the major fintechs at the time, Creditas, Enova, which was an American company. So several of these guys, we all went to the central bank to show the model. And interestingly, one thing that impressed the central bank, and I have to say, was a meeting to show the model. And we had something around 30 individuals from the central bank from the different departments, including the audit department, the enforcement department. So it was kind of a tense meeting. Everyone was kind of nervous. And then it was the norms director at the time, Otávio Damasio, that organized this meeting because they wanted everyone from the central bank to see the technology and the effects, right? And so I remember Creditas explaining and showing the numbers and say, look, I lent using this platform with a bank behind. I lent all over Brazil with the same reach of Bradesco and Itaú together, but without one single branch. It was only using the cell phone. And I remember the face of the central bank saying, what? I said, how do you know that? Well, because we use the GPS. And then he opens up a map of Brazil with all the dots, right? And they show where the credit was granted. And they were granting credits in the middle of the Amazon region, right? And he showed that. And you see the central bank saying, wow, interestingly. And then he said, look, I look at the model. I talked to Bruno here. I'm happy with the model. And I, at the moment, I start breathing relief. Like, oh my God, thank God nobody goes to jail here. And the second thing is that he said to the team there, do you mind if we follow you guys closely? You're not regulated. You don't have to show me, but do you mind sharing? And then everyone looked at me saying, can we do that? Are we going to go to jail? I said, go ahead. So
it's better than going to jail.
Exactly. And then they said, sure. 2 years later, after this meeting, the central bank calls the same group of individuals and us and say, you know what? We really like this model. We like technology. Let's create a super light bank. And that's where the credit fintechs appear. So we help the central bank to draft the model of a bank which has a 2 million reais, $300,000 capital requirement, which can lend, but and in the same model, you lend, but you sell your loan to a fund, a securitization vehicle, or to a fintech. So that was the first time these super light banks come in. And that's where the central bank has an important role because they allow that. And in addition, they added payment services. So now you could have a super light bank with credit card account payments and credit with a very low capital requirement. So that was the second, let's say, wave of importance that the central bank created so that attracted these players. And then going to what your question, Gustavo, was the PIX, which is a state-owned, controlled-owned system by the government that allow payments. And the question is, why, right? Because we did have already the normal payments, which, by the way, were faster already back then. In 2000, we created a TED system, which allowed payment within few hours in 2000, right? And so the point is that, so central bank created the fintechs, central bank created the payment institutions. Why create that? And I was luckily again, I was very close to this because we were helping WhatsApp to enter Brazil, and they were going to use the WhatsApp Pay. And that's where the central bank blocked WhatsApp, and they were launching the PIX. And so I had the privilege of hearing from the chairman of the central bank why a state-owned system. And the answer is, and the chairman of the central bank is Roberto Campos, who actually is a liberal by nature, right? He said something is that there are situations that free competition doesn't solve. In Brazil, we created the payment institutions, we created the fintechs, but they all have to use the payment system that is owned by the incumbent banks. So if we don't fix the payment part in a system that is cheaper, equal to everyone, competition will never be true. And so we decided to create our own system which allow everyone to use at a lower cost, fast, 24/7, but is equal to everyone. And so that's why they created the PIX.
Just so everyone knows, I mean, we take it for granted that PIX is state-owned and everything, but in India, for example, which doesn't have as far as an oligopoly as in banking system as Brazil had in the late 90s, the UPI is controlled by the big banks. So the UPI serves them and is the structure alongside their interest for that. Whereas the PIX in Brazil is state-owned, and I mean, it's revolutionary. The financial inclusion, the credit part, credit accessibility for everyone, and the number of business models that can be built upon the PIX infrastructure is unbelievable. I mean, everywhere that you go around the world, when you mention Brazilian regulatory environment in terms of fintechs, everyone gets jaw dropped, thinking, I never expected that to come from Brazil.
Yep. And if you use Jaime's points of connecting the dots, and here's the perfect connection of dots, right? Because at this time when PIX comes up, you have already a larger payment institutions market. So they're offering these e-wallets, right? But these e-wallets had to use the normal banking payment system. Now they can use the PIX system. So if you use these e-wallets, it can be offered to anyone. Plus you can pay for free, real time, 24/7. That's where it brought a huge portion of the population that was unbanked into the banking sector. So it's using the Jaime connecting of dots phrase is the connection of dots in the sense that you have the payment institutions, now you have a system, and you wanted competition on the lower classes. So much so, people, if you go to the street here, you see a beggar, someone begging money, and they have the card saying, oh, can you give me money? I lost my job. Instead of asking cash at the car, they give the PIX number. So you don't have the excuse to say, sorry, I don't have any money. Say, no problem, PIX me. You can simply PIX this number by opening your app and just putting the number. You can make a payment in 6 seconds.
And regulatory and legal wise, what were the challenges and the pros and cons of introducing and growing the PIX so much?
Oh, Jaime, you going to ask something before I answer that, or no? Okay. I think that the challenges, to be honest, was who can join the PIX? Because obviously, if you wanted a system that is comprehensive, you need to open up the system for PIX. So I think one of the big challenges that the central bank faced was, okay, Bradesco, Itaú, Santander, I don't have a problem then joining the PIX. The problem is we have a huge amount of small fintechs, which are the payment institutions, right? Which offer e-wallet, but they need to enter the system. The problem is the system has an SLA that the payment has to happen in 6 seconds. How do we do a small company to enter the system? So they created the direct and indirect participant, which is a larger bank necessarily is a direct participant. In other words, it has a reserve account into this state-owned system, the PIX. But it can rent part of its reserve account to the smaller one, to a smaller fintech, which rents the license of the bank to perform PIX. So in a way, you piggyback on the larger bank in order to offer PIX to your clients. So they created this system. The problem, or looking forward, one of the problems that the central bank face over time is that the bank is subject to regulation. If he screws up, he gets a fine, he needs to fix the problem. A payment institution that is under the volume required, but is connected to the PIX, is not subject to enforcement of the central bank. And so when a failure happens, How do we enforce? And so we had some cases of hackers, and Brazil is very creative on that, creating hackers and stuff, whereby a lot of PIX payments were illegally done, or people were put into scams and lost money. And so one of the things that the central bank had to change was to bring regulation, or to bring these payment institutions that were outside of regulation into regulation in order to participate into PIX. And this is happening in the last couple of years.
And it's an amazing success. And we've been talking about a lot of initiatives that generate a lot of success. And this is a personal curiosity of mine. Open finance hasn't gotten there. I mean, open finance in Brazil has not yet brought the expected results in reducing cost of financing and improving the lives of families and companies. And that should have happened alongside PIX, right? What happened there?
Well, I think one of the things, looking back always, right, is our open finance is extremely open in the sense that they want to include more than any other country in the world. So in Brazil, the open finance we started called as open banking, and now is open finance, includes your data, personal data of the bank, opening account information. It includes all banking products, but includes as well investment in the stock exchange and other kind of investments, insurance, and 401k or social security as well. So our open finance is very, very large. And so that's one of the reasons as well that is not as fast as, because it's a huge elephant, right, that needs to be adopted by everyone. So that's one of the reasons. The second is the banks are still learning how to use all this massive amount of data. So there is a learning curve of the banks. And so that's why the process is taking longer. But if you look at the numbers of how many people adopting the financial products that are starting to appear now, for example, if you go to a large bank, you need to make a payment and you don't have a balance. The bank says, oh, by the way, you don't have a balance. Would you allow me to access through Open Finance other accounts so that we can take the money from the other accounts? So they're starting to create the products whereby open finance makes a difference. So I think it's a question of time, honestly, that is going to happen. I think that PIX was such a big success that took away the light of open finance, which is obviously much more interesting in the sense of competition, but is much more complex to, roll out.
So you're an optimistic in open finance and in lowering cost of capital in a country where interest rates are so high and it's so hard to get a credit.
Correct. And if you look numbers of the central bank, right? If you look how much credit has entered the population, you see a decrease, something like 6 or 7% of decrease of concentration of credit for the larger banks to the fintechs. 6% of Brazil is huge in 5 years, 4 years. So it's like, if you look at the number, so it is working, but obviously credit, especially in Brazil, is not easy. Remember, we are now having base interest rates of 2 digits. We are trying to control inflation. So it's a challenging market. So that's why there's also macroeconomic moves also influence growth of credit and products.
That's super interesting, Bruno. And moving on onto the topic of digital money and currency. What's your take on Drex and also crypto? I mean, what kind of role can it play in Brazilian fintech?
Sure, good question, Jaime. And this is the next level here that we're going to face, right? I think interestingly, Brazil is looking into Drex, but the Drex in Brazil is not going to be the same Drex in other countries. One, for a very basic reason. If I need to transfer money to you, I do a PIX. So the models whereby Drex or the central bank digital currency is used to make payments in Brazil is not going to be used, because you don't need that. You have PIX and it's so easy, and you just scan code. Now they're implementing PIX by approximation, so you can use your wallet and go like this and pay with PIX in a merchant. So honestly, Brazil, Drex is not for payment like that. Drex is going to be used for DVP, delivery versus payment, for buying financial assets and eventually non-financial assets. So we are actually gearing our Drex much more for large, fast transfer of money for deliver versus payment models. And in Brazil, because the central bank under the law is the only authority with power to issue currency, crypto in Brazil is not a currency. Crypto is an asset. So much so that you pay capital gain when you sell your Bitcoin. You don't, because only an asset pays capital gain. So when you say, oh, I'm going to pay with crypto, actually, you're giving an asset in payment. You're not using a currency. So that's an important distinction, because that's why crypto is allowed in Brazil. And what is happening now, the central bank just issued 3 sets of public consultations, which is a way that the central bank, before drafting a regulation, puts a regulation for public comment. And so they issued 3 sets of rules which will create or regulate what we call the VASPs, virtual asset service providers, which is very similar to the model of the payment institutions, but the difference is they are intermediating or selling or custodying crypto assets. So if you do any of these activities, you will need a license in Brazil with a low capital requirement, but with know your customer, reporting, blah, blah, blah. And you will be able to use the crypto as payment or intermediation. And you will be able also to use stable coins for foreign exchange purposes. Today, foreign exchange is only for currency. And in Brazil, if you get a Bitcoin, if I buy a Bitcoin in Brazil and I transfer the Bitcoin to you, Jaime, in Spain, and you convert this into euros, this is an illegal foreign exchange transaction, because in Brazil, you need to exchange reais into euro with a gatekeeper in Brazil. What they're doing is they're bringing the stable coin as another method of transferring money as well. So what is happening in Brazil is that basically 2 things. One, the DREX will grow for DVP, and crypto will be regulated, but in a very light way, and will bring a new set of companies that will become VASPs regulated by the central bank.
And how is that different from merely regulating crypto brokerage?
Sorry, Gustavo, what's the difference?
How is that different from merely regulating the crypto brokering houses? Is that about tokenization of real assets, of real estate, stocks, and all the jazz? Is that about expanding crypto penetration in the Brazilian population, which is already pretty huge, by the way? Is that about regulating something that is already happening?
Correct. So in Brazil, if you compare to the US, for example, when you have the crypto regulation until Trump, at least, was really against models. And so we had a lot of American clients facing a lot of problems in the US. Brazil was, central bank adopted the model of wait and see. They wanted to better understand the impacts of a crypto in an economy, and they decided not to regulate. That being said, obviously, you cannot, if a crypto is equal to a security, you cannot offer, because it's a security, and you cannot use crypto to perform foreign exchange transactions. Apart from that, you're free. So what the central bank is regulating is, in fact, the brokers of crypto today, but they are regulating as well custody. And this is something kind of complicated, because they are very, very concerned of scandals we've seen in the US, whereby the custody entity goes bust and the money disappears. So they seem to be very concerned in regulated the custody services and who's responsible if the crypto disappear, if the key is robbed and money is transferred illegally. And so that's what we are seeing in Brazil. Now, tokenization itself, the central bank has a very interesting way of looking at it. If I have a car and I tokenize the car, the token is the car. There is no transformation. It's only because you tokenize it. So the central bank has to say, if the rule for that asset applies as a financial asset and you tokenize a financial asset, that continues to be a financial asset. It doesn't change, right? And so that's where the central bank. So tokenization itself is much more linked to DREX than crypto world, because in their mind, the token is just a representation of the asset, and it doesn't transform the token in something different what the asset is.
And going back to what happened in the early 2000s and with the regulatory movement and enabled the fintech boom, is the central bank as keen on revolutionizing everything again as it was at that time, or is it more steady paced?
So I think what we see, and again, it's a big picture view, right? It's not like, but if you see is the beginning of 2000s, you see a lot of, you can come in, you don't need a license, start operating, low capital requirements, go ahead, I like your model, blah, blah, blah. Now that the market has grown, for example, PIX. PIX now, they don't allow a payment institution that doesn't have a license to operate in PIX because, well, the market has a lot of players now. There was some problems, so we need now to be stricter. Now they're starting to adopt Basel rule for credit card issuers. So payment institutions that issue credit card, they have to have more capital if they give credit. So they're becoming more stricter. They are coming up with additional capital requirements if you do additional activities. They started to create new accounting rules to bring them closer to the banking sector. So why is this happening? I think I would say this is a pendular movement, right? They open the market, allow a lot of people to come in, and now that the market is maturing and competition is happening, the pendular is coming towards, okay, let's hold a little bit, let's organize, let's fix problems, let's be more conservative in some aspects, but still they're open to new technology. They still want to see new ideas. So for example, there is something in Brazil that the central bank is trying to solve, which is difficult to solve, which is the crédito consignado, consigned credit in the private sector. It's something that they are looking for new technology, how to solve the problem that we don't have in the public sector, but how to create a solution for consigned credit in the public sector that doesn't have a payment centralized like the public sector. And so things like that, the central bank is saying, hey guys, if you have an idea, if you have technology, bring it to me. If I have the pen and I can actually draft new regulations, if this is a great solution to give more credit to the population. So that's what I'm saying. So there is a natural movement of being more conservative and holding down the pace because it worked, the rules. But at the same time, they are looking for alternatives for more credit.
Interesting. Bruno, one more question on the topic of all things digital. What do you think is coming up, and what are the next opportunities that are being created by the regulator? For example, in terms of crypto, tokenization, dynamic boleto, digital duplicates.
So I think interesting, there are two things that the central bank is really betting this year. One is the duplicata electrónica, or the duplicata, I don't even know, is the trade bills, I guess, right? Translates as trade bills. But using a centralized registry system. So every time someone renders a service or deliver goods, basically a trade note is issued confirming that a good or a service was delivered, and the debtor of that obligation says, okay, I will pay you this date. So now this is becoming electronic and is being registered in a centralized registry. So basically it's a receivable registration, right? But interesting in Brazil is that for every trade bill, there is a tax confirmation, nota fiscal. So in Brazil, the risk of a trade bill being false is very low because you can cross-reference with the tax authorities saying taxes were paid because a service was rendered or a good was delivered. And so that's quite unique of Brazil. And because you have this centralized registration, now this receivable can be sold and can be given in guarantee for any transaction. And this information is publicly available because there is a centralized registry. And this is a market that I heard numbers, but you're talking about $3 trillion market of Brazil. Because can you imagine all the services and all the goods being delivered? There is a trade bill associated with it, and you can register. So this market is huge. And that's one of the things that the central bank is betting to allow, especially mid-sized and small companies, to use that to bring more credit. So that's one of the bets, I would say, of the central bank, which makes a lot of sense. And so they are, discussing with the registries. They are creating what we call the boleto inteligente, which is when you pay these trade bills, usually you pay with this barcode system. The problem is if you sell these receivables and you have issued the barcode, the money goes to the wrong person. They are changing the technology of the barcode so that if you change the owner of the credit, when you pay the barcode automatically sends the money to the creditor of the transaction So that's something that they have done. They are already implemented, and it seems to be working. So that's one of the things. The second thing that the central bank is starting to bet is the merging of what we call the off-ramp and on-ramp. So in other words, now they're regulating crypto. They are trying to bring them together to the traditional methods of payment. So you see Visa or Mastercard coming up with ideas with they are launching this card, a credit card or a debit card, that if you don't have a balance in reais, but you have a balance in stable coin, you could use and accept as a payment method as well. So in other words, the card will be accepted in the merchant. So what we're starting to see, which also goes together with decentralized financing, is merging of different methods of payment and using in the world for a day-to-day thing. So that's something that we start to see the movement, which is quite interesting because you start creating availability of money where you wouldn't have. For example, we have one company in our program here that actually tokenizes assets of the agriculture business. So, for example, the company is called AgroToken. You deliver soy to Bunge, right? Bunge says, okay, I will pay you in 90 days, but you, producers, set the price of the commodity until the 90 days. We managed to tokenize this agreement, and we can break the amounts in 100 grams of delivered soy. And Visa, for example, allows these tokens to be used to pay for goods, for purchase of goods. So what happens is that we are tokenizing a credit right, but because the all infrastructure of tokenization is possible to transform that token to cash immediately. So this producer now can buy a coffee at Starbucks using the credit card. It can give this token at John Deere to buy a tractor, or it can give this token to Santander to finance the construction of a new mill for producing of the soy. So it's something quite interesting that we start seeing as well. So tokenization is allowing transformation of money on something that was illiquid because of the lack of technology.
It's unbelievable. I mean, to think about these developments, I was actually thinking about here how this will mess up the calculation of M1, M2, and all the monetary base for inflation purposes. It's truly remarkable. We always talk about how startups revolutionize everything, and this conversation is a fantastic example of that. But looking back now, how do you think the incumbents reacted? I mean, in this new wave that you're currently mentioning, with all the trade bills and crypto and drags and all these new use cases, tokenization and so forth. And by the way, we really like Eduardo here. Eduardo from AgroToken. He's a dear friend and incredibly nice guy, and incredible company as well. How have they reacted? How much how better are they to compete with the new fintechs that are coming up?
Yeah, okay. I would say you can divide in very clear two phases, right? There is the phase was like disbelief. So they would say, no way, they don't understand, they'll not make it, which was the beginning of Nubank and Neon. And they were surprised because they didn't expect the VC money to help these guys to grow so fast. So that was the first phase. The second phase now is respect and eventually learning. So we start seeing a change of heart of the incumbents. And for example, we helped the other day Bradesco to allow a foreign exchange transaction using crypto. Bradesco, who is a very traditional bank. Bradesco hired one of the persons in Brazil that most understands about crypto. He was hired in this special division of Bradesco to develop the crypto solutions for Bradesco. So that's an example, right? You look at Itaú, you see measures whereby you can do everything electronic. You can pay with Pix using points. Again, something that would never exist in the past. So what I'm trying to say is that they reacted. They certainly reacted, and they're starting to move very quickly. And either they buy companies or they create divisions. I think the challenge for any incumbent bank is the system. Unfortunately, the systems, the legacy systems, are complicated. the implementation is not necessarily fast. And so what the struggle that we see is exactly this. How do we change very quickly without affecting the normal functioning of the bank? And solutions like create a new division, create another cell, create a secondary parallel bank to perform that is something that we start seeing. So the truth is that the banks are reacting. And remember, they're not suffering only the fintechs. They are suffering competitions from Banco Inter, from C6, and other banks that are not fintechs by nature, but were born in this new environment whereby technology is the prevailing factor. So I would say these guys are waking up. They already woke up, and they're moving fast.
And in terms of internationalization, we talked about how the Brazilian Central Bank has been exporting technological knowledge to Colombia, Mexico, and other Latin American countries. But do you now see other countries as developed or as interested in being developed, in developing themselves, their financial systems on a technological basis throughout the world, either in developed markets or developing markets?
I would say more developing markets, but an interesting is that what is the influence of the banks, the private banks in that specific jurisdiction, right? Because one of the reasons of success of Brazil in this world was the ability of the central bank to be independent from the larger incumbent banks. I've seen several situations, including open finance, whereby the bank says, I won't be able to do it, it's too big, it's too difficult, otherwise I'll have to stop. And then the central bank would turn and say, if you stop, you're going to be fine. So you decide what you want to do. And so what we see is that in some jurisdictions, there is a lot of influence of the larger banks with the regulator. And so this affects the implementation and the ability to change. Whereby other jurisdictions where the central bank has more independence from the larger banks and less influence from the larger banks, then you see the implementation to be faster. So that's an interesting thing that I learned seeing the different jurisdictions, is how independent is the central bank from the bigger banks, and not independent financial or anything like that. Is independent in the sense that the bank has such an influence that the central bank will be afraid to change something so that it will affect the banking sector.
On the topic, I mean, we've been talking a lot during the podcast about large organizations trying innovative things. You guys in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, started an accelerator program, which is probably not the obvious thing to do. So Bruno, tell us a bit about that. How did it come to be? What were the learnings for such a large organization such as yours to go into this, which is not obviously direct business?
Sure. I think one of the reasons that we wanted to, and I was one of the had the idea, or the crazy idea initially, and now looking back it worked, but obviously it was a crazy idea, was to have access to new ideas and new technologies, which our traditional clients would never give to us. And so it was in a way a leap of faith, saying, look, these are young people, we don't know if they're going to work or not, but we need to learn the technology. We need to learn what is possible to do, because if we learn and these guys do well, I think it's going to be impressive. But the most important, one of the major reasons that we wanted to do it is that in Brazil, there is a joke here in Brazil that says Brazil is not for beginners, right? Because it's a complex market, very sophisticated, and you need to be very fast in decision making, right? And so one of the things we thought is that if we give legal support for these people, they can actually grow something without taking risks, without really knowing. And so we thought that giving this help would allow technologies to thrive. And to be honest, it worked, because obviously and it only works because we see a young person coming into the firm with a great idea, with a great technology or potential great technology, but would be impossible to do without the help of a big firm, because too many legal challenges. And so when we do this, we merge this, young person with protection of the legal system, whereby, he will be protected by not screwing up. That proved to be a very efficient way to bring technology into the market in a safe way, especially in the financial sector. That, together with the curiosity of the central bank to say, do you mind bringing these guys in? I want to understand what they are doing. So this happened several times, whereby we brought them to the central bank, and then the central bank says, "Oh, interesting," and eventually influence the creation of a new set of rules in the future. So that's the main logic of the program, which is allow the technology to achieve its best performance with the necessary protections of the law. So that's what we do it. But obviously, it is a high risk program because we don't charge anything, and we only make money if this new guy goes and gets money with the VCs. Otherwise, we take the full risk. But again, it proved to be a good model and it works.
And you have successful cases such as Neon, Rebel, SpinPays, and so many other. I believe you have 13 exits, right? What were
16 successful exits.
Congrats. And out of 52 investments, that's amazing.
52 investments, but it's a rolling investment because we have new guys coming in and others coming out. And the logic as well, the program is these guys cannot pay us normal fees, right? But after 5 years, this is a 5-year program. After 5 years, usually if they did well, they have enough money to pay our fees as a law firm. And so they leave the program, but they still need to use us. And the idea is that these guys are going to do M&A, they're going to do IPO. And so we perpetuate them in the firm as well.
And what were the learnings?
The learnings is, it's a funny, one thing I say is that you see that person, the person is brilliant, has a great idea, and everything should work, and it doesn't work. And then you see the other person that has a very simple idea, not that brilliant, and it works. So the learnings is that it's impossible to know which one is going to work or not. It's just a question of believing and helping. But at the end of the day, and I think, you guys are VC, execution is everything. So great idea, great, but if the person doesn't have execution, it doesn't work. And I see myself all the time talking to them because they start something and then they see another idea, and then they come to us with 20 ideas and nothing done, right? And I say, look, why don't you focus in one idea, do that, and that's it. Don't start getting the world solution. Just go for one thing, and that's it. If you continue doing 20 things, we won't be able to stay in the program because you're not going to do anything. And so at the end of the day, execution is everything.
100%.
Those are some very good numbers, Bruno. I think that in your future career, you have the pedigree to become a VC. That's for sure. If that's
I'll talk to you. I'll talk to you, Jaime. I'll talk to you because I'll join you.
Closing questions, Bruno, that we ask every single guest. Can you recommend a book of some form of content, can be startup related or not? And can you also suggest someone to invite to the podcast? Sure.
So I think one book that I read, which has to do with the founder, right? Which is called in Portuguese Equipes que Brilham, or Brilliant Teams, by Daniel Coyle. Basically helps someone to how to create a successful team, because at the end of the day, fintechs, it's a teamwork. And so if you don't know how to use it, that's it. So and when I read it, and I have my own team, I have 50 lawyers in the team here. So for me, it was very interesting, but also it's a good reading for you to see teamwork, and goes again, execution is everything, right? I would say if you can get Cristina Junqueira to talk in your podcast, happy to introduce you to. It's fantastic because she has a very, very interesting view of things. And also being a woman, because the financial market by definition is a male market. And so she's one out of the curve, and is an interesting, so happy to help you guys. It would be great to have her.
We'll give it a try. Happy to give it a try. Bruno, this has been amazing. Thanks a ton for the insights and for the history lesson, because I think that's what it was. Thanks a ton.
No, my pleasure, and congratulations on your funds as well. And happy to next time to come to Brazil with Gustavo. Happy to have a coffee here.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye.